Hello world! So I'm now the proud owner of some land in Japan's countryside, the Inaka. Now first off, what in the world is Inaka? For people from Tokyo, I think it's anything outside of the metro area. Even with a population of 100,000, I think Tokyoites would call a city of that size Inaka. Where I now have land in is a city called Nikko. It's officially listed as having 75,000 residents, which perhaps sounds like a lot, but this is after merging 5 different areas into one in 2006. With the population decline, merging small cities, towns, and villages together has become the norm in rural Japan. The area formerly known as Nikko City only has a population of 11,000. It's the neighboring former city of Imaichi to the east that has the major population center comprising of 55,000 residents. Where I got land is in the original Nikko area of 11,000, so small enough that I think most Japanese would consider it Inaka, but Westerners might call the specific place I own a property in a resort town or vacation area. How did this all come about? It all started last year, when I was wondering if it would make sense to consider moving to a location outside of Tokyo in 3 to 5 years when our kids would be either in university or working. My wife and I mostly work from home, so we don't actually need to live in Tokyo for any work purposes. A place that was within a couple hours train commute back to the city seemed like it could work for us. And even though we don't need to live in Tokyo, there are still reasons for us to be close. First off, I would need to be in Tokyo to film some things once or twice a month. We have family and friends living around Tokyo, so would want to visit them. There are big city things to do, from museums to live shows to shopping to, well, anything. It's Tokyo. And for traveling inside or outside of the country, Tokyo is also a main hub. In any case, the thought was that if we got a place relatively close to Tokyo, we could commute in a couple times a month when we need to, but otherwise, live outside of it. But why move out of Tokyo? You can be a lot closer to nature, and there's also the potential to avoid the heat island of Tokyo if you go to the right region. Summers are getting hotter and hotter, and I think it's safe to say that most residents of Tokyo would rather be elsewhere in July and August. Also, land is very affordable. So affordable that you can build a custom home for the price that you can get a pre-built cookie cutter one in Tokyo and probably still have money left over. Land can easily be purchased for 10 or 100,000 US dollars, and you can even get a 20 to 50-year-old house on it for that price. But there's a downside to living in the Inaka. A lot of places would require you to own a car. Could we find a place that was close to a good train station? And would that place also be within a 15-minute walk or bike ride to basic amenities like grocery, convenience and drugstores, restaurants and cafes, medical clinics, and so on? After casually searching over the course of months and spending many hours, I started to zero in on the Nikko area. The JR and Tobu Nikko train lines have direct connections to Tokyo that can get you into the city within a couple hours. So last October, I went to Nikko with my wife's sister Ako to have a look and see what kind of properties and amenities would be available. Now, for those of you that don't know, Life Where I'm From is an incredibly tiny company that my wife and her sister both work part-time in. My wife helps with research, translation, and setting up shoots, whereas her sister, Ako, does some filming, also sets up shoots, and unlike my wife, reluctantly shows her face on camera. My wife and I are also back and forth between Canada right now, so her sister often ends up dealing with a lot of things in Japan, which includes this property in Nikko. But back to the story. Another thing I was looking for was that if I was going to move out of Tokyo, I wanted a part of town or a street that felt like I was in rural Japan. To me, that meant a quiet street that was close to nature, which meant close to the mountains, water, and trees. So if you took a street like this, it really wasn't of interest to me. Whereas if you travel a few streets away, this feels more interesting. This seems like it could be a good candidate, but there are no stores or public transport close by, so not as ideal. Eventually, I ended up honing in on the areas of Yasukawacho and Takumicho, which are located along the Daya River. Once you go off the main road, it gets really quiet. But if you go to the main road, you have a convenience store, shops, and bus stops. And because of Japanese zoning, there are actually shops found off the main road as well, in what is mostly a fairly quiet residential zone. Because the area is across from a World Heritage Site, Nikko Toshogu, the streets are done up a bit nicer than standard. The only downside I can think of is that it's a solid half-hour walk from the big Tobu Nikko train station. Although on the bus, it's only a 5-minute ride, and by bike, a bit more than 10. Anyways, walking around the area, I cajoled Akko into asking locals if there were any properties on the market. And that's where the story became the story you're hearing now. It turns out a local knew of someone that was actively selling and asked if I would like to see the place. I thought, why not? I wasn't in the market, but it'd be good to get an idea of what was available. The house was an Akiya, an abandoned home that hadn't been occupied for a decade. The lady who was selling inherited it from her late husband, who had inherited it from his father. She wasn't living in the country anymore and was ready to sell. Upon entering, the place was in a lot better shape than I thought versus how it looked on the outside. Although it was so old that there was no official blueprint and no living person knew how it was built, when it was built, or what it was built with. Investigating the floors, I could literally see right through the floorboards to the soil below. Is something like this even fixable? Is this one of those teardown homes? Or can you invest a certain amount of money into renovations and bring it up to a decent living standard? Despite these massive unknowns, it was enticing, and I really loved the location. And with the size of the property, I could probably build an additional new unit on it, whether the old house would need to be torn down or not. But my wife and I hadn't even decided if we actually did want to move out of Tokyo, and if we were going to, it wouldn't be for another 3 to 5 years. However, the friendly local suggested that if we bought now, we could run it as a minpaku before we moved in. In English, I think the closest translation of a minpaku would be a guest house, a lodging where you stay in the same building as the owner. But you can run the minpaku without having to physically be there, so this could be no different than what most would think of as an Airbnb vacation home rental. For homes categorized as a minpaku, you can rent it out to guests for half the year. We found this out because we went to the city to see if running a lodging business was even possible in that home and in that area. It turns out it is, and that you can also run a ryokan. Most people think of a ryokan as a traditional Japanese hotel that comes with breakfast and dinner, but license-wise, it simply means it's a hotel that can have guests 365 days a year. The license is more complicated to get than a minpaku, but the possibility was there. So after doing a lot of researching over a furious few days, we decided to see about making an offer on the place. I know, kind of crazy to go from thinking about maybe getting a place in 3 to 5 years to all of a sudden shifting it to 3 to 5 days. This was a big step for my wife and I, and honestly, I was surprised that she gave the go-ahead to try this out. So we contacted the seller, saying we were interested in talking more about potentially buying, and silence. It was quiet for a few days until we heard back that she had sold it. I'm sure that many people looking to buy a property have had this happen to them, ready to make a big commitment, and then finding out you couldn't go ahead with your plans. This shocked me since the property had been abandoned for over a decade, and I didn't even consider that it could go that fast. I was thinking that I'd have weeks or months to make a decision. After that experience, we now had the idea in our heads that we were willing to run a guest house or hotel, and we kept an eye out on local listings in the area. It turns out there were no others at the time, but we check about once a week to see if something would pop up. Then a few weeks later, a place within a 10-minute walk of Nikko station became available. It was newer than the place we were previously considering, but it wasn't in the same ideal spot that I'd wanted to live. But for travelers, the proximity to the station would make this a convenient spot. So in order to do some research, I asked Akko if she could make an appointment to check out the place. She got one a few days later, but the day before she was scheduled to make that visit, the property was sold. What was going on? I thought this was a depopulated area with not much demand. If you look at the numbers for the amalgamated Nikko city, they have lost 22% of their population since 2000. It was clear from walking around various neighborhoods that nowhere was immune to the population decline and that there were many abandoned homes and vacant properties. Looking up the official vacancy rate, it's 23%. This doesn't necessarily include properties that aren't occupied for the majority of the year, so I wouldn't be surprised if the real numbers of unused properties is in the 30% range. After not being able to bid on a house due to timing, we signed up on a real estate website to be notified when a new property went up for sale. We soon found another property that was in my ideal location, but was oddly priced much higher than what you'd normally see. It turns out that this place was all set up to be a ryokan, but a few weeks before opening, they decided not to run it. So it was a turnkey situation where one could potentially buy it and end up running a ryokan the following month. So within a few hours of the listing going live, we contacted the real estate agent and said we wanted to see the place. We also said that if the place looked good, we'd be ready to place an offer. How real estate transactions generally work in Japan is that it's on a first come, first served basis, and you pay the asking price. Being first in line, we thought that we finally solved the timing problem, and our only decision was to see the property in person and decide if we really wanted to buy it or not. And what do you know? Before we could even see it, the devastated real estate agent contacted us saying the seller had pulled the listing and no one would be able to buy it. What in the world was going on? We were 0 for 3. The third time was definitely not the charm. So perhaps another month goes by and another property pops up. It's not in my ideal location, but again, it's in a convenient spot for travelers that's close to the Tobu Nikko station. This time, we're actually able to see inside of the house. The reason I suspect it was on the market for more than a few days is because the buyer wouldn't be able to build a new house on the property. You could renovate the place, but because of the current access to the property, you wouldn't be able to do anything else with the land. Theoretically, you could negotiate with neighboring properties, purchase some more access, and apply to be permitted to build new, but that's all ifs and buts. Still, it seemed like this place could work out. That's when, for some reason, my wife decided to reconsider a piece of barren land that I had suggested much earlier. This piece of land had been on the market for months, so I guess I kind of lied to you by saying no other properties were available for sale in the location I thought was ideal. The big scary factor about it was that the land is split into 2 levels, and we were told that if you wanted to build on the land, you'd probably need to redo the retaining wall at a great cost. Still, I thought you could probably do something with the small piece of land on the top, so why don't we contact a builder to check it out and let us know what could be possible? At this time, my wife also found a company that built a small unit that seemed like it could theoretically be placed on the land. We ended up finding an architect we liked, and after he looked at the rough specs of the land, he provided an assessment that out of the 400 square meters of land, we could use up to 60 to 80 of those square meters to build something on it. This is because based on the angle and height of the retaining wall, you would only be allowed to build a certain distance from it. Upon hearing this, all sorts of possibilities opened up in my mind. Our house in Tokyo is only on 50 square meters of land, so working with 60 to 80 made it completely workable to me. But to some other purchasers, that would mean you're restricted to only being able to use a fraction of the land, and I guess they got scared off. After the fact, the realtor admitted to us that several people were interested in buying previously, but all got spooked by the retaining wall situation. How much land could be used would depend on a soil test to judge the stability of the ground. You could do a test before buying, but you'd still need to do a test once you have your building design in place. The ideal result would be that the land is stable, and you don't need extra foundational support. The worst case scenario would be that you'd need to get that extra support in place, but that you'd still be able to build. However, the key thing was that even paying for that extra foundational support, it'd be a fraction of the price of redoing the retaining wall. With all this information in hand, we had to make a decision. Go for the old house that can only be renovated, or go with the land where only 20% of it is usable for a building. Interestingly, either way, building new or renovating, the timeline would be the same. It would take a year before we could start using it. If the old house would have been usable in a few months, I was prepared to go ahead with it. But since it would take a year for either project, my wife, her sister, and I decided to go ahead with the land purchase. And after 9 months from that initial visit to Nikko, I now own some land there. There were boundary agreements, soil tests, and groundbreaking ceremonies that have occurred during this time, as well as hiring an architect and working on designs, but those are all stories for another day. Anyways, thanks for watching. See you next time. Peace. I hope some of you will get a chance to visit in 2025.